I played a pretty big pot in a tournament on ACR yesterday, and it's been bugging me for a while. So I thought I would do a video to go through my analysis to see if I played it correctly and I was just unlucky, or if I made a mistake somewhere along the line. This hand is from a $16 tournament on ACR online. I'm relatively new to the table. I don't have more than 10 hands on anybody in the table, but since the blinds are 250, 500, I'm assuming it's not that far into the tournament, and I don't assume that any of my opponents are super, super tough. I'm just going to consider them as just being average Sunday online players. So we get to this spot. I have 70 big blinds. I have most of the people in the hand covered, and it folds around to middle position, raises a minimum raise, gets two calls, and then folds to me in the small blind folds to me in the big blind. This is a spot where I'm going to 3-bet almost all the time. I'm well ahead of the range of these two people who flatted here. I'm in decent shape against whatever his opening range is. And it's not really a hand I want to play against three other people. So I made it a relatively large raise. I went 5,500 thinking that would clear out most of the trash in their range. And I got two calls, one more than I was expecting, but nothing too terrible yet. Now the pot's 18,000. I've got 33,000, but I've got my two opponents are between 21 and 23,000 here. Flop comes 10-10 deuce with two spades. Obviously a very good flop for my hand. I'm likely, I have a lot of equity against whatever they called me with before the flop, even if they have a jack, even if they have a 10, a hand like jack 10 suited or 10-9 suited. I still have ways to improve, and when the flop is paired, it's much less likely that they actually have a 10. There's only two 10s in the deck. So I think this is a decent spot to semi-bluff. It's also a decent spot to overbet the flop. Looking in at this after the hand, I didn't realize that they were so close to having just a pot-sized bet behind. I decided I was going to bet small on the flop and then jam the turn for most turns. So I bet 7,000. The first player called me and the second player folded. The turn came the two of diamonds, and in the moment it seemed like a pretty bad card for me. All of his tens are now full houses. If somehow he had a deuce like ace deuce suited, that's a full house, and there's still a lot of middling pairs he can have in an ace or a queen, or a flush would improve against them. So now that I'm looking at it, I don't think it's quite that terrible. But in the moment I checked, and he shoved, and now I've decided if I want to call or fold. I do have decent equity against any pairs that he's betting. I don't see he's got too many any bluffs I'm actually ahead of at the time. Some of the time I'm drawing dead, and the other times I'm drawing to spades, an ace, or a queen. I'm going to only count 8 spades because I'm assuming he's going to have a pocket pair when he's betting, and one of those pairs is going to give him a full house. So I'm gonna have about 14 outs. What I want to do now is just take a quick look at the overall pot odds here. So the pot size is a little bit over 32,000. I'll just put in 32,000. And he bet 16,000, which in this case is fairly simple. It's about half pot, so I'm getting 3-1 on a call, which means I need about 25% equity to break even on the call there. So what I want to do next is go into Flopzilla and try to figure out what his range is and how my hand is doing against that range. So 25% isn't that hard to get to. It depends on how often he's got a full house versus two pair or a bluff or a flush draw. So I'm going to go into Flopzilla and see how my hand does against his range or possible ranges that he can have. First, he called a 3-bet pre-flop. I'm going to assume he's a little bit loose because he's deep. I don't see him folding really any pocket pair before the flop. I don't see him folding any of these big suited aces. I'm going to give him a lot of the high suited cards, maybe some suited connectors and suited gappers. Probably ace king, ace queen, some big broadways, and maybe a few Maybe a few wheel aces here. Now, some of these hands he might 4-bet. I don't know how often he's going to flat aces with two people behind or kings, maybe even ace king suited. And now we'll put in the flop here. So it's 10-10 deuce with two spades. And then I'm filtering out all the hands that are going to call a flop bet. So we've got quads, full house, three of a kind. We've got any over pairs. And I think he's going to call with most, or at least some of his pairs that are less than tens. I mean, often people are going to say, well, he can have ace king, ace queen, or just, I'm not going to fold a pair to one bet, especially when the bet is less than half the pot. And then flush draws. Now, right now there's 13 flush draw combinations, but when I put in my hand, ace queen suited, that actually takes a lot of the flush draw combinations out, and he's only got really 7. Because I'm blocking all the nut flush draws with my hand, I'm blocking a lot of the high Broadway spade combinations from his hand. So as you can see, when we get to the turn, he doesn't have that many bluff candidates unless he's floating fairly wide on the flop. And so let's see what my equity is right now against that range that calls the flop. On the flop, the range is slightly ahead, 53 to 47, which means that it was definitely a good flop bet since he's folding over half of his combos that I bet to. And when he does call, I still have a whole lot of equity. But when I put in the turn card of the 2 of diamonds, now a lot of his hands turn from 3 of a kind to full houses or 2 pair to full houses. And the equity drops, or my equity drops to 31%. That's still over the threshold of 25% that I need. So if this is his range, then it's not that bad of a call. It's a slightly profitable call. The question is whether or not this range assumptions are good. Sometimes he may not bet all of his low pocket pairs. When he does that, see the equity goes slightly down. I'm still over 25% here. If he doesn't have some of these suited connectors on the flop, if he's just not bluffing and only betting 2 pair or better, if I take out, let's say, all of his bluffs, then my equity is 21%. That's underneath the 25% threshold. So it's a pretty close decision. It depends on how aggressive I think this opponent is. It looks like making a hero call is either slightly profitable to not profitable, and it is a really high variance spot, so I'm not upset at myself for folding there. Generally, people at low stakes to mid stakes underbluff, so and I've only got 11 hands against him, so I don't really have any evidence to say that he's going to be any more aggressive than the average opponent. So I don't hate my fold there. Of course, on the turn, my other option is just to shove. So I'm going to take a look at that math as well. The pot, again, was 32,000. The bet I put in was 16,000. When he folds, I win 32,000. When he calls, the pot is 64,000. And then I'm going to calculate what my equity is against his calling range. And then I'm going to figure out what percentage of hands he's calling. And then on the turn, I took out all the flush draws. He's got 65 combos that he's going to call with. And that's 65 out of 72. And our equity against that range is 26%. So equity against that range is 26. And that is 65 combos out of 72. That means that he's calling about 92%. And he's folding less than 10%. So 92% of the time we have 25% equity, and 8.5% of the time we get all 32,000. When I add those two together, the net value of the shove is 17,000, and the bet was 16,000. So it's about 1,900 over what the bet was. So it is a profitable bet. The big blind at this time was 500, so it's a 4 big blind plus EV shove given that particular calling range. Now, I don't think in game he's going to call with some of these pocket pairs, so I'm going to take out some of his baby pairs. In terms of the math, it doesn't really matter which sets of pairs I take out, just that I take, because my equity against 9s and 8s and 7s is the same as it is against 4s and 3s. There's no way to counterfeit his pair except to hit an ace or a queen or to make my flush. When I do that now, the equity of my hand goes down because he's got more full houses in his range and fewer pairs that I can outdraw. But the number of combos he calls with also goes down. So we'll say 41 combos he's calling with, and our equity in the hand is now 21.5%. But we're down to 46 combos. That means we get a whole lot more in fold equity. You can see that I get 11,000 chips in fold equity. The bet was 16,000. I don't really need to make that many chips up in terms of winning when I get called for it to be a profitable bet. You can see the overall net equity